Amy, you have kind of it looks like a very delicately curated scene or a very informal scene, and I can't decide which behind you
Yeah.
with your Zoom background.
Yes.
So.
Yes, I have.
Yes, both? Okay.
I had, yes. It was a delicately curated scene at one point, but then I actually started using the books on this bookshelf, and so then they started falling over.
Yeah.
But this is a print of the Japanese woodblock print of a dog that looks like my dog, and then we have like a Japanese face and some bowls I actually made, and then some like I have my book over here, but I have like my advisor's book up there for moral support. My first book, some other like special books that I like to have in my background, just keep me kind of feeling supported.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, you were saying earlier, like you just finished your last lecture of your semester, so of your quarter. So, you know, things happen and books get used over the course of the semester. So even if, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what happened was that the library actually emailed me and was like, you really actually do have to return those books now. And those are a bunch of the books that I had on this shelf. And so yesterday I just like tore them all off the shelf and yeah.
I had a pile that's not in the frame of books from the library that I had checked out last March. Literally, it's been a year and a half. I just kept renewing them. And finally the library was like, no, we're done. You got to bring them back. And I was like, are you sure? And they're like, yeah, we're going to block your account. And I was like, damn it. So I had to like take a suitcase to the library and like return all the books.
Yeah, we did. The art library decided that too, is that they postponed everything during the pandemic and then they just made everything due at the end of this month. So I got an email like, these books are due, and it was like a list of 150 books. So luckily I was able to renew online many of them, but I have to go hunting for some of them in my office at some point in the next day or two. So yeah, they decided it's time to do that, I guess. But
yeah.
Anyway. All right, we are a few minutes in. I think if it's okay, we'll get going. So welcome everybody to Drinking with Historians. Thank you for joining us again on sharing your Friday evening or afternoon or wherever you are kind of with us. We're very pleased to be joined today by Professor Emily Stanley, who's a professor in the Department of History at Northwestern University. She's a specialist on modern and early modern Japan and the author of two really excellent books. Most recently, Stranger in the Shogun's City, A Japanese Woman and Her World, which was published last year in 2020. And then before that, Selling Women, Prostitution, Markets, and the Household in Early Modern Japan, which was published in 2012. So we have lots of different interesting things to talk about here. We were already plotting and scheming before the episode started. But first, the most important question, Amy, is what are you drinking tonight?
All right, well, I have a drink that I call the Tsuneno after the protagonist of my recent book. And the reason I call it the Tsuneno is because it's what I drank mostly while I was writing. And it is warm bourbon from my kitchen closet. So the drink itself is not very fancy, but the important part is the cup in real Japanese fashion. The drinking vessel is also important. So this is an example of a kind of glassware called Edo-Kiriko, which became popular in the city of Edo, now Tokyo, in the 1830s. So this glassware, not this specific cup because it's new, but this style is a contemporary of Tsuneno. So I thought it was appropriate to put my Tsuneno in a Tsuneno cup.
Well themed. There you go. Varsha, what about you?
I am drinking Yamazaki 12. It's one of my favorite Japanese whiskeys. It's the Yamazaki is one of the oldest distilleries in Japan. So I decided, okay, I might as well pull out some Yamazaki. I was telling Amy before that I have a wide collection of Japanese whiskey. I have a Hibiki, a Hakushu, and an Akashi, but I will stick with the Yamazaki for today.
You got to be careful where you place your camera, or else if you put them all in front, like you're going to disappear behind your bottles. So yeah. Wonderful.
What about you,
so
Matt?
I'm drinking not bourbon tonight, which is a little bit weird for me. It is a warm, kind of muggy day, and so I am drinking wine actually. This is a sparkling red wine called Lambrusco from northern Italy, the area around Bologna. And like I was saying, I think a few weeks ago, that the Americano, which is a cocktail that I was drinking when I went, and I spent a lovely summer in Bologna. This is the wine that they serve in that area. It goes really well with Parmesan, Parmigiano Reggiano, and cured meats and things like that. It's very refreshing. It's served slightly chilled, so it's really delightful. And I have the whole bottle here, so we'll see how it goes the rest of the evening. I was telling Amy on Twitter, it's a 2-drink minimum anyway. So anyway,
I'm glad I poured myself a double, although
there you go. Okay, it's going quickly. So yes. Mm-hmm. The nice thing is the bartender is always there to refill you because you're the bartender. Right? So, on this show, as opposed to every other happy hour. So anyway.
Unfortunately, I don't have a bartender in the spare bedroom from which I record all of my Zoom appearances, but
maybe that's the next evolution of Drinking with Historians, is we send you a servant after COVID, of course, when you can have strangers in your house, to stand behind the video and hand you drinks.
I totally endorse that, and if you do that, I'm totally coming on again.
Okay, all right. Let's Varsha, maybe we'll write a grant to Mellon or something like that. Maybe a Ford Foundation can subsidize that. We'll see what happens. So
I have a first question. So I've never taken a Japanese history class. I've been in Berkeley since undergrad, but sadly I've never been able to take a class with Beth Berry or any of those people. So for anybody who's watching who's like unfamiliar with Japanese history, could you quickly like orient us in like time and space? Like, why did you choose to study this place, Edo, the period that you study? How did you get into this period, and what's special about it?
Yeah, so I came to Japan first before I picked a period. And that was because when I was growing up as a kid, my father was a government physician scientist at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And he had a lab, and he had all these postdocs in the 1980s who came over from Japan. And so I grew up around a lot of Japanese people. And I was from this, town in Maryland that I had not traveled beyond when I was that age. And they mostly came from Tokyo. And they told me these, amazing stories, because right then in the late 1980s, Tokyo was really the center of the world. It was, during the bubble economy, Japan is number one. People thought that Japan was just going to take over the world. As funny as that kind of seems from our perspective today, we know what happened later, which is the bubble burst and a period of economic stagnation. So when I got to college, I decided to take Japanese, which I hadn't had the opportunity to do in high school. And I kind of fell into it because Japanese is such a difficult language that I took first year Japanese. I was an idiot. I was a freshman, and I decided I could take Japanese Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday at 9 a.m. So I went to Japanese class at 9 a.m., 5 days a week. And what happens after a semester of Japanese is you don't know anything. You can't read it, you can barely talk. When it happens after 2 semesters of Japanese is that you still can't read anything or really talk. And so it becomes this kind of like sunk cost thing. Like, all right, well, I've done all this, right? I have to keep going. And so the only major that would allow me to count all this Japanese toward my major was East Asian Studies. So I had an advisor in East Asian Studies. His name was Hal Bolaitho. He was a professor of early modern Japanese history, which is the period I eventually ended up in. And I, at the time, was really interested in women and gender. That has been my interest throughout my entire career. I find it really difficult to write about men, actually, or anything else. And I wanted to study ancient Japan, specifically the classical period, because I'd heard about Murasaki Shikibu, the Tale of Genji, Shōnagon, the Pillow Book, all these kind of classics of the ancient world that were written by women attached to the Japanese court. And so I went to this older Australian professor who was my advisor, and I said, I would like to study ancient Japan. And he laughed and he said, you don't want to do that. And I said, why not? He said, well, we already know everything about ancient Japan. Everything there is to know, we already know. All of the sources have been published. We just keep working on the same things over and over again. What you really want is to study early modern Japan, because we have this kind of vast archival record. We have all these things in manuscript. You can even find people's shopping lists. And I was sitting there at the time, 19 or 20 years old, thinking, why would anybody want to read somebody's shopping list? But I did end up taking his advice. I switched my concentration to the early modern period, and 25 years later ended up writing a book that is almost entirely about things like people's shopping lists. So I think that in the end he was right. But I would say that the reason he was right is really important, which is that the period that I study, which is between 1600 and 1868, and in Japanese history, we call that early modern, even though Europeanists yell at us about it, is unique because it has such a vast and deep archival record. You can find almost anything in manuscript, and we have not even scratched the surface of what is available. So I think that kind of record alone gives us such a valuable perspective on the early modern world, and also the lives of ordinary people, just very mundane things like shopping lists that you can't find for other places. And so in that sense, in a global perspective, I'm very glad that I ended up in Japan.
Yeah.
So quick follow-up, just really quick, why were all these things saved? Because in other cultures, right, like if I'm talking like early modern India or early modern Europe, the average person's like daily record isn't really saved. So is there like a reason why during this period all this stuff is saved in manuscripts from this period?
Yes, so the first reason, the kind of underlying reason, is the explosion of literacy. So early modern Japan is a highly literate population, even in the countryside. So if you look to China, for example, your average village headman would not necessarily have been literate, as I understand it, in the Qing, in the late imperial period. But in Japan, it was very important for village headmen to be literate, because everything legally ran on precedent. So in order to do anything in the village, the headman had to have records to say like, okay, this is what we did 50 years ago in this same type of situation. They had to produce all these documents. They had this culture of obsessive record keeping. And that ultimately, it originated in the samurai class, which is highly bureaucratic, filters down to the village headman, and ultimately becomes something that's adopted by ordinary people, because they too, in order to have access to the law, to get anything done, had to be able to produce documents. And so we have, especially in rural areas, households that had important roles in villages, either they were the village headman or they ran the local temple, have boxes and boxes and boxes of manuscripts just sitting around in the house that no one can read, because they're written in a form of manuscript in handwriting that is not so legible anymore to people. And so when I was training in early modern Japanese history, the graduate students had a joke that the two things you needed to be a really good historian of early modern Japan was you needed to be able to drive, and you needed also to be able to drink. And the reason was you had to drive out to these rural areas to meet these people who had like boxes and boxes of stuff in their storehouse. Then you needed to take them out for drinks. And while taking them out for drinks, convince them that they should show you their documents. And these were the two crucial skills. Wow. I've never done that. I do most of my work in archives, but I think it's really telling about like the records that are left.
That's really interesting too. When I did my PhD at Berkeley, and one of my teachers there was a gentleman by the name of Robert Mentano, who wrote a number of really wonderful books. But he wrote a really great book about the small Italian archive, and he tells the story about it, is that that's literally what happened. Is he was on vacation with his wife. He went to this small town. He spoke fluent Italian because he had done all of his research there. He was chatting with somebody there, and they said, "Oh, we have all this really old stuff just up in our bell tower. Do you want to take a look sometime?" And like over drinks, and then he went up there, and it was like this treasure trove of 14th century documents about the entire urban life. And so he was able to reconstruct this book just because he was driving somewhere and he was drinking somewhere. So I think that's an underrated skill. I mean, this is professional development, Varsha, is what I'm saying. Like it's this show right here,
right?
Yes. If we were driving somewhere, this would be research essentially. So I did want to kind of springboard to a different question. One of the things you've mentioned several times is you work on early modern Japan, and this is the question of periodization. Especially when you said Europeanists get mad at you because the dates don't get matched up. And as a medievalist, right, like this is something that people in medieval studies have been talking a lot about. Is how appropriate is it to talk about the Middle Ages or medieval kind of in other areas? And sometimes you know, it is appropriated in other disciplines and stuff like that. So kind of how do people who work on Japan, like how do they classify their periods? Like, is there conversation with Europeanists and others with these classifications, or is it more of an internal discussion that's happening?
Yeah, so there's a very kind of rigid kind of Japanese categorization of which period is which that is internal to Japan. And they do use the term Chūsei for Middle Ages, which means middle era. And that goes, you know, from about 1185 all the way through sometimes 1600, sometimes 1450 or so. And so it's a very large period, and there's a kind of interstitial period in between Chūsei, the medieval period, and the early modern. Most of the time, the early modern is the English term that we impose upon the indigenous Japanese term, which is called Kinsei, and Kinsei literally means like the nearby era. And then we have a completely different era that starts in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration. That's the modern period. And that goes to the end of the war in 1945. And then we have Genzai, which is like the contemporary period from 1945 onward. And so it's a different periodization, although that 1945 kind of cutoff is very familiar, right? Because of the global event of World War II. One of the things that So I am of two minds about early modern. I used to be a huge proponent because I thought, you know, it's really important to be able to speak across fields. And if I keep saying that I'm a historian of the Edo period, I'm a historian of Tokugawa Japan, I'm a historian of the Kinsei, like nobody in American academia understands what I'm talking about. Like nobody's even heard of Edo. And so you need a periodization that will allow you to speak across. The problem with the periodization is that if you say early modern to like somebody who studies England, they think you're in the 1500s, right? So, you know, there's a kind of slippage, you know, to say that I'm doing something on the early 19th century and it is early modern. You get a lot of kind of quizzical looks from that. And so I've started to say 19th century rather than early modern. But I think there's a really good argument to be made that comes from my perspective in Japanese history, but also comes generally from a perspective on East Asian history and American history, that the period to 1850 or so is a uniform period, and that we should not be cutting things off with the Enlightenment or the French Revolution, which are real, the Meiji Restoration. So, you know, there's 1848 in the middle of the 19th century. Our periodization buildings have done and bring that kind of 19th period.
Selling women, right? You think that like the book is, you know, just about prostitution, but it's more about what's happening within these closed doors. But that's not really what you focus on. How did you come to the topic of like looking at prostitution and looking at how like the culture around that, right? And actually telling a story that's like looking at prostitution from outside in instead of like inside out.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I came to the history of prostitution simply because as a graduate student, I could not read manuscript. And so I had to rely on printed sources. And most printed sources, the things that people had put into print, right, and didn't leave in manuscript that had to do with women were legal codes, mostly. And in legal codes and kind of criminal cases, you tend to see two types of women. You see adulteresses, and I wrote an article on adultery. It was my very first publication. And then you see prostitutes. And so I thought, you know, as a PhD student, well, I've done the adulteresses, so I'll just like move on to the prostitutes. But I was really concerned with resisting this kind of exoticized image of the courtesan and the pleasure quarters and like these beautiful accomplished women who really provided entertainment, and it was really just very sophisticated and really very artistic, and it was all written about from the perspective of pleasure seeking men. Like that's why we have the term pleasure quarter. It is the Japanese term, but you turn it around, it's not a pleasure quarter for those. I was very interested in providing a feminist perspective on this work and avoiding most of that. The dissertation, the book gets into it a little bit, the dissertation absolutely avoided all of the kind of high class courtesan discourse in the city of Edo. And I was like, let's look at the countryside. Let's look at these kind of lower class brothels and the experience of women working there. And by concentrating on that, I was able to see, I think, more clearly the way that these structures were embedded in communities and the way that economically they supported entire communities or just running based off the revenues from prostitution. And I thought that kind of putting women's labor, then we'd already heard this narrative about like beauty and art and culture.
Interesting. So like the only book that I've sort of read that sort of touches on this and like sort of informed my understanding of geisha was Memoirs of a Geisha. And so when I watched that movie as well as like read that book, it's like I think we as Americans who don't know a lot about it probably romanticize the idea of a geisha as well as the idea of like samurai, but like what were geisha and these prostitutes are like not actually, you know, they don't really have this romantic role in Japanese society. What is their actual like position?
Yeah, so I would say like the image of geisha and prostitutes was always kind of highly aestheticized and commodified. And so you have all these beautiful woodblock prints and bijinga, which are like these paintings of beautiful women that kind of commodify the image of the high class quote unquote courtesan. But that's different from the kind of reality of sex work for most women who are in that trade. And when we're talking about geisha specifically, I have a student who's working on geisha right now. It's really important to differentiate between periods because in the early modern period, which I study, geisha are often referred to as being just like prostitutes who might have a different fee structure. They might also entertain clients, but it's absolutely clear in the documentary record that they have sex with clients and that is what they're being paid for in addition to art. When we get to the modern period, when we get to like the 1870s and beyond that, geisha are really interested in differentiating themselves from prostitutes because prostitution has become a social problem and it's become regulated and kind of problematized in a different way by the state. And so geisha and geisha house masters can then make this argument of like, actually, we're not like those women. We don't sell sex, we sell art. And that has been the kind of geisha tradition that's gone into the present. And that's why, you know, even today, if you look at geisha, geisha will say, we are not prostitutes. We don't have a history of prostitution. We sell art. And that is true going back to the beginning of the modern period. Most.
And so the reason I brought up samurai is because the one thing that I know about a little bit about Japanese history is that the idea of like masculinity and like self-sacrifice and all these things are like very important in this during this period. I was wondering if that's true and if that's the role that sort of samurai maybe after this early modern period ends, maybe in the Meiji era, right? Like that's sort of what they learn from the early modern period.
Yeah. I think that samurai masculinity was always a live issue from the moment that there were samurai, right? These warrior traditions are often just completely obsessed with masculinity and martial valor. And so that is not really a we're invested in is not the kind of masculinity that we now associate with either masculinity or samurai. So one of the most famous books that people go to, an early Edo it is like the way of the samurai is death, like you must always be ready to die, you must always be ready to protect your lord, you must always be careful of your honor. A lot of it is also like you must always oil your hair, you must like be ready to present yourself like in a lot of it is like about fashion and self-presentation in ways that we would think do not go along with this kind of cowboy image that we have of the samurai. If you go even further back, like to the medieval period, you see a lot of war tales that involve samurai who are constantly like playing flutes and crying. And the more you can cry and emote, like the better samurai you are, because that is kind of sophisticated samurai masculinity. So I would say that like samurai and masculinity have always been intertwined because it's a martial tradition, but like what the content of that masculinity is has changed dramatically over time. And in the modern period is the first time you really see like samurai is an accessible ideal for all Japanese men, not something that only applies to 10% of the population and it's very like concerned with differentiating from the masses. And that's when you get like samurai promoted along with universal conscription to say like all Japanese men could become like samurai if they join the army. And then after 1945 and you have the pacifist constitution, this image changes again. And it's like all Japanese men can become like samurai if they go into business. So
yes,
it has become like a kind of icon of Japanese masculinity, but it's really interesting how it's multivalent and it's changed over time.
interesting. Okay, so changing gears a little bit. I haven't read. Oh, do you want to ask a question, Matt?
Yeah, if I could. I'm sorry, my internet's a little bit funky,
Matt's
so
internet.
yeah, it's been a little bit. I hope you can hear me. Anyway, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned about the geisha. Is that because you know, recently there was an issue with an article that was published about making claims about kind of comfort women and during World War II. And you, among other signatories, asked for a retraction. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about that, because it seemed to have something to do with kind of this stereotypical image of Japanese women and its relation to kind of what was going on here. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I was just thinking like, oh God, I need more drinks for this one. So, to kind of put this in perspective, a Harvard law professor named Mark Ramsayer published an article in the International Review of Law and Economics, which is not a history journal, that made some very provocative and outrageous claims about comfort women. And comfort women, for those who don't know, in Japanese, ianfu, it's a kind of euphemistic term for women who were conscripted or abducted or sold into sexual labor for the Japanese military during the Pacific War. And there were all sorts of women who were sold into what were called comfort stations or brought into comfort stations or recruited. The vast majority of them were Korean. Korean was at the time a Japanese colony. And they ended up in the comfort stations in all sorts of different ways. Some of them were abducted. Some of them had been sold by their parents. Some of them were pulled out of Japanese POW camps, especially like in Indonesia and in China. But in any case, and some of them were actually Japanese women who had already been involved in sex work, who kind of got trafficked over to the battlefront. But what these women all had in common was that they entered this system, which the military regulated and controlled. Often they were transported on military convoys, in fact. The military actually set the prices for these women's services. And they were coerced into providing sex for soldiers. They couldn't escape. They were on the battlefield. They could not resist sex with soldiers who wanted it. If they did, they were, subjected to incredible violence. And so this was, no matter how these women entered this system, they were raped repeatedly over the course of years in these comfort stations on the battlefront. And and that has been the scholarly consensus since the first comfort women started coming out and talking about their stories in the 1990s. And what what Mark Ramsayer, the law professor, argued in this article was, in fact, this is the kind of coercion story is entirely a misconception. And in fact, the women who went to comfort stations were volunteers. And he made this argument about the Korean women and said, in fact, they had incentives. They were really well compensated. And what this really was is private agreements between women and brothel keepers in which both sides had incentives to make these deals so that women, quote unquote, would not shirk. Like imagine shirking at a battlefront brothel, which you can't escape. I mean, the whole thing was just completely bizarre.
Yikes.
Yeah, it was out and thought, well, like, this is ridiculous. And so a number of us actually wrote to the journal, like, what are you even doing? This is bizarre. But then we started going back through the sources. And I was really intrigued, and a number of us were involved in this project. It was me, David Ambaris, Hannah Shepard, who's at Cambridge, Chelsea Sheeter, and Sayaka Chatani. And we together started going through, we made a Google Doc, we started going through all the citations and realized that the citations were bad. Often the sources were distorted. The things just didn't say what he said they said. So for example, in one instance, he claims that a 10-year-old girl who was actually a Japanese girl who was transported not to a comfort station, but to an overseas brothel, knew exactly what she was getting into when she agreed to sex work overseas. And that is like ridiculous on its face. So you can kind of like ridicule it. It says it's an oral history taken from this woman. And she says, I had no idea what I was getting into. I didn't even know what sex was. So there were distortions, and that was only the beginning. So we wrote this third miscitations, misreadings, like bad translations, everything that was going on in this article to support this claim, which is really a political claim that has been advanced by the Japanese right wing, because state responsibility. And so we sent this 33-page document to the journal saying, like, please retract this article. It's actually fraudulent. And we know that not everybody has the same standards, but the American Historical Association, luckily, does have standards for research fraud. And so we're able to pull those and be like, look, this does this kind of distortion that in the historical profession is out of bounds. Do you think we were successful at getting this article retracted? It looks like no, not at all. They have not done a thing. So that article remains up with a letter of concern attached. The letter of concern, though, is kind of floating around. So it looks like it's attached to 3 different articles. And the authors of those other articles are really upset because it looks like their articles are like under this cloud of suspicion. Meanwhile, it's their most downloaded article. They're getting a ton of clicks. And it has really provoked a backlash from the Japanese right wing, because this scandal got written up in the New Yorker. We tweeted about it. As you know, I'm on Twitter. I got so many abusive and threatening messages from Japanese right wing accounts that I actually had to call the university police and report them. My fellow authors also got completely trashed just for writing this very sober academic critique. And the last I'd heard of the author, he had been in Japanese addressing a Japanese right-wing symposium dedicated to celebrating his work, at which they had a life-size poster of this man.
What? Oh my gosh.
He looks like, I mean, it's like he's become an icon to the Japanese right wing. And he gave some remarks in Japanese that called me a Stalinist. So that's where we stand. That's why I needed extra drinks to be able to talk about this. So I think it's in some ways, it's a really inspiring story about scholarly collaboration. Like, we brought this group together across continents. One of us was in Singapore, in Britain, in Japan, and we came together and for 3 weeks worked basically 24/7 on this fact checking. It's the middle of the pandemic. We had to pull books from everywhere. We were like out on Twitter. Does anyone have this book? Can we get a copy? And we managed to create this document and to make it public and to expose what we think is a distortion behind the research. It had no effect, though, that we know of on the academic establishment, and that has been very troubling. So we're wondering, like troubled. Like, now what?
Wow. So a less difficult topic. I joke, it's still difficult. It's been 3 years. 3 years ago, you published a really amazing article in Perspectives in the American Historical Association, similar to this, right? You wrote about writing the history of sexual assault in the age of Me Too. And it's the person you're writing about is, I think she's the protagonist of your second book, right? So I was just wondering, how did you decide to write about this? Like, why did you choose to write about this? How did you get to this idea of maybe I should reorient how I think about believing women in the archive? And what was the reaction you sort of got to this piece?
Yeah, so I actually, I had been researching the letters of this woman named Tsuneno. And one of the things that she described in her own letters was an experience of what we would call sexual assault. She did not use those terms. She didn't have that terminology to describe what happened to her. But she'd been traveling with this man, Chikan, and she said, you know, he asked repeatedly if she would marry him. She said no. He threatened to abandon her on the road. And so she had no choice but to do what he wanted. And the difficult thing about this story is that her account changed slightly over time. So when she first narrated the story in Letters Home, it was like Chikan was a friend to me. And then the full his story only came out months later, as she kind of recapitulated it again. And when I first read through this, I was trained to think like a social historian, which is always kind of consider the bias of your sources and try and triangulate with other sources and think about, you know, is this really true? And the problem was that, you know, she had reasons to lie about this. She had run away with a man who was not her husband, who her brothers did not know or like, and she had ended up in this situation. And so rather than saying, you know, I ran away with my lover, which would be absolutely unsayable, it seemed like, well, maybe she said this because she needed things from her brothers who would be more sympathetic if this was a kind of coercive situation. And so that's the way I originally kind of conceived of it and spoke about it. But it was really kind of during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings for the Supreme Court. Brett Kavanaugh's from my hometown, Potomac, Maryland. And so was, so there are many stories about that. But I was really kind of invested in watching this play out. And I remember I was sitting in a coffee shop in Evanston one day, and I was thinking about this, and I opened my laptop to work on probably chapter 7. And instead I started writing this essay about, you know, Tsuneno's experience and my experience as a historian, wondering if, you know, I click on all these things on Twitter that are like, believe women. And yet I did not believe my own protagonist, even though I didn't have a credible counter narrative. Like I'd never had Chikan showing up saying like, I didn't rape this woman. I never had anybody actually in my archive casting doubt on this story. I was doing that myself. And so then I had to think about like, why am I doing that? And what purpose does that serve? And when are our traditional social history methods of like extreme skepticism actually occluding the story rather than making it more clear? And so in the end, with the caveat that we cannot always believe women, especially the women in our sources, I mean, women lie like everybody else, when there is no reason to explicitly disbelieve a story, perhaps it's better to just go with the grain of the source rather than doubting it. And so I wrote an essay to that effect. And because it captured the moment, I think a lot of people were very enthusiastic about it. But it's an unorthodox way of doing social history. And of course, there's pushback from people who think that more skepticism is always good. And, you know, there's also the kind of counter argument that, as I just said, women sometimes do lie. And we know that right from the American archive itself. You know, we have so many accounts of especially white women lying about being raped by Black men. So what do you do with that? And my answer to that was like, well, you weight the epistemic scales, right? Like you try to figure out which account is the one that's kind of socially less likely to be believed and kind of try to counteract that imbalance. I think today I would not have written the same essay. What I like about the essay is that it kind of made the case for how I treated that assault in the book, which is to just narrate it straight and say that she was assaulted. Although recently a review came out of that book, my second book, and said like it's an apparent rape. So I'm not sure even that did what it was supposed to do. And I think if I were to rewrite that essay now, it might look different. I'm not sure how, but it was definitely like the product of a certain moment and a certain type of like really focused rage that I just opened my computer and wrote an essay, you know, in less than 2 hours.
So, I mean, I think that this brings up, we have a number of really good questions I want to get to in the Q&A in a minute, but just to quickly follow up on that, you know, your point about kind of we're always taught as historians, well, maybe not we're always taught, but generally we're taught as historians to be skeptical of our sources, right? Is don't just kind of treat them as transparent in any kind of real way. But I think I really like the point that you make about like, I can't remember the exact phrase, the epistemic, the epistemic
Scales.
weight, the scales, right? Like how do you weigh this like in a particular context? Because I think too often it's really easy to, just as you shouldn't accept everything as transparent, you shouldn't expect your sources lying about everything. So you really do have to make important judgment calls about that when you're dealing with your sources, and context really matters in that particular case. Yeah. So,
yeah, and I think that is important to think about, like not only who would be more likely to be disbelieved at the time, but what are my own biases as a historian? Like in my own time, what do I believe and what do I not believe? And how do I try to sort that out and possibly compensate for that too?
Okay. All right. So shifting gears, we have a number of, I'm going to kind of aggregate a few of the questions here. And understandably, a lot of the questions are about pop culture, especially American pop culture about Japan. And so one of the questions, one of the things that people are kind of curious about is what is your favorite or least favorite samurai movie?
Oh, wow. I am notorious for hating all movies.
Okay.
However, I know it's terrible. It's like saying that I hate all novels. It doesn't make sense to hate an entire artistic form. And I TA'd when I was a graduate student for a lot of courses that endlessly showed samurai movies. And I was always like, I can't believe I have to watch another one of these. But if I were to choose a favorite, it's probably a movie from the 1960s called Harakiri, which is, it's what Americans call incorrectly harikari, which is, the practice of committing ritual suicide. And what it is, it's through the kind of story of a man who is driven to do this. It's like a blistering social critique that applies to the 1960s as much as it does to the Edo period. So that one I like. There are also like some sillier samurai movies that I like. And now I'm like, because I've had all this bourbon, I'm forgetting the name of it. I will come back to it. There's a very silly samurai movie that I always assign just because it's unintentionally hilarious. And I think that everybody should watch it. So as soon as I remember it, I will let you know.
Okay. It's not the Tom Cruise one, I assume.
Oh, that is also unintentionally hilarious, but I don't necessarily recommend it. I should rewatch it though.
Okay, fair enough. So, sorry.
Oh, I remembered. It's called Gohatto. And it's incredibly silly because it's about, it's not the topic exactly that's silly, it's the execution. It's about the fall of the shogunate, basically, and all these men who end up in this military academy who are there because they are the force, the Shinsengumi, that's going to defend the shogunate against the rebels. And this very beautiful boy shows up and causes this like complete romantic meltdown among these like samurai men. So in some sense, it's like a critique of samurai masculinity and a kind of investigation of like male sexual practices at the end of the Edo period. But on the other hand, it is like incredibly, like you can't tell whether it's deliberately funny or just like incidentally funny, because the main character keeps like looking at the camera and saying, do you think he has that tendency? By which he means like to fall in love with men. And so like it's both like incredibly dramatic and like centers on the adventures of this beautiful boy who ends up being kind of a sociopath, but also like incredibly bizarre. And the last frame, I'm not going to spoil it, but it makes no sense. So I always show this to students and they're always like, what are we supposed to take away from this movie? And I'm always like, I don't know. Didn't you enjoy it? Wasn't it weird?
Okay, I do have a question that doesn't fit into some of the questions that we got, but we didn't get to talk about your second book, Strangers in the Shogun City, and you've mentioned Tsuneno a few times. So if you could just quickly tell us, how did you come by her story, and how did you decide to center your second book around her story? Because I think some people categorize your book as historical fiction, right? And so how does it fall into that category? Why does it fall into that category?
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by that miscategorization because I am a huge fan of historical fiction. And that's in fact how I came to history. When I was a kid, I loved historical fiction. And I especially loved historical fiction that's centered on women and women's experiences in the past, the things that I could not learn in like kind of normal history classes. And so I really kind of self-consciously use the techniques of fiction and novels in order to tell this story, which is entirely non-fictional. So I pretend sometimes that I'm like really annoyed that people perceive this book as fiction, but I'm also, I mean, I don't want scholars to think it's fiction, but if ordinary people pick this up and they think it's fiction, the only problem that I have with that, it's a really bad novel. It works much better as history than it would as a novel. As a novel, it makes no sense. And so often readers are disappointed because they pick it up and they review it on Goodreads and they're like, I don't understand why she died at the end. It's not fiction. So anyway, this protagonist, Tsuneno, was someone I discovered while looking online at the Niigata Prefectural Archives website for documents that I could assign to my students. And they had an internet document reading course in which they had all of these documents that they wanted to introduce to the public to kind of bring people into the archive to show what they had. And one of them was a letter from this woman, Tsuneno, and she was in Edo, and which is now Tokyo. She'd gone to the big city. She was writing back to her mother in the countryside, and she was saying, I'm fine, and everything in Edo is delicious. And that, like one phrase, everything in Edo is delicious, really captured my imagination because it sounded so contemporary and sounded like something I could have written in an email from when I first went to Tokyo in 1997. And so I was really intrigued by this very direct voice of this woman in 1840 was that date. And then the archivist said in the kind of introduction, we have 100 more letters from Tsuneno in the archive. So I went to Niigata. I looked at all these letters, and this is the tip of the iceberg of what exists in Japan. There are probably like 100 Tsunenos in different places, just waiting to be discovered. But I went and I read all these letters, which at the time I couldn't read, which is a whole other ordeal, and all of the sources around them. And it turned out that she had this like really amazing, almost Dickensian life in which she'd come from this really prosperous family. She was the daughter of a temple. She got divorced 3 times. She ran away to the city on her own in the company of this sketchy man who raped her. And then she had to make a life for herself. She lived in a tenement. She worked as a maidservant. So she went all the way like up and down the social scale. But what's important was she was literate. So she could write about her experiences among Edo's lower class, which is something that you typically do not see. And so she ends up actually working in the residence of the Edo city magistrate, who ends up being incredibly famous. He is a kind of icon of like, he's the wise city magistrate. He's supposed to be, according to kind of folk beliefs, covered in tattoos. He's always on television, like as a fictional character, but she actually lived with him in his house. And she also kind of lived in the house of a kabuki actor who's very famous. So she was this one figure who really could show you what life is like in the countryside, but also life like up and down the social scale in Edo, which I found really intriguing. And so wanted to make her the centerpiece of a book that would introduce kind of general readers to Japan in the first half of the 19th century.
That's the kind of serendipity in the archives, I think, is so interesting that it happens, and that's why archivists are historians' best friends, right? Is they know what's actually in there, and you know, working with them is always kind of a treat. We did have a really good question from Rob, who asked kind of a follow-up on kind of the samurai thing, not specifically about that, but about kind of teaching. And, you know, oftentimes, especially first year students who are coming to, you know, maybe one of your classes or a class on Japan or something like that, most of what they know is kind of filtered through American portrayals of pop culture. So how do you kind of work with that? You know, do you kind of incorporate that? Do you try to intentionally push back against it? Like, what are your kind of strategies there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there is this kind of preconceived idea of what the samurai is that people imbibe. It used to be, right, like the book or the mini series Shōgun, and now it's all of the anime and all of the video games. And when I talk about some of these figures, like if I lecture about Oda Nobunaga, for example, people will say, I played him in a video game. And so people already, and so it's interesting because people already have kind of cultural knowledge and they have a reference. And when I was starting out in this field, the students didn't have any references. They did not know who I was talking about at all. What I try to do in my classes is show how the image of the samurai has always been a construct. In addition to there being historical samurai, and the realities of these historical samurai and the images that were produced about them never really matched. And so in one of my classes about samurai, I go through like different, so I take events, like for one of them is the Genpei War, but one of them is Chushingura, which is the famous kind of 47 loyal retainers incident in which all of these retainers went to avenge their lord in Edo, and then they ultimately all had to commit suicide because they contravened the law of the shogun. Very famous. And I look at, first the kind of historical documents about the incident, but then also how Japanese people portrayed that incident in different genres. So we look at the kabuki play, and then we look at the movie, and then we look at how we look at manga, right? Like we look at then finally like how Americans have perceived this story, so that we can see it's not just like an American gaze or a contemporary gaze that's going back to the samurai, but actually it's a continually constructed image over time, starting from the Japanese themselves.
That's great, thank you. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, I have a random question just because I'm not seeing a question that in the Q&A. I was recently reading about one thing that I love about history is like my dream was to like one day write a history of like the mafia. Like I think the Cosa Nostra is really cool. But recently I was watching, it's a really horrible TV show. It's called Hawaii Five-0. And so I was like learning about the Yakuza because like when I watch a TV show, I go on Wikipedia and learn about it. And recently I found out that the Yakuza originated in the 17th century, like during the period that you study. And so I was just wondering, when you were studying like women and prostitution, does like crime sort of like fit into your story, or like the way that these crime families sort of worked? Maybe not the Yakuza, but like other crime families. Does that fit into your story?
Yes, like the precursors to the Yakuza definitely show up in my first book. And that's because prostitution is a market that is difficult to regulate from the point of view of the state. And it's partly because sovereignty is so parcelized that like if a lot of these people were highly mobile, both the prostitutes and the brothel keepers. And so it was difficult for, let's say a brothel had some women under contract, and then some recruiter or somebody came and stole the women and brought them to a different domain in a different jurisdiction. They couldn't go chase them down because they would have to cross these political boundaries that were very hard. And so they relied on people, these kind of like kyokaku or like gangster types. They didn't necessarily call them Yakuza, but they were the precursors to the Yakuza, who are these kind of like people who can cross borders, who have gambling networks, who indulge in some criminal behavior, and who can wield violence. They can kidnap the women back, but also have a very particular relationship to the state, because the domains, like the governors too, cannot, for example, chase criminals across jurisdictions and apprehend them, because you'll end up in some other lord's territory, and that's a no-no. So you have to like rely on criminals to catch other criminals, which is something that's very like common in early modern Europe as well. And so you have these figures, right, who are crime bosses, gamblers. Sometimes they're sumo wrestlers, because sumo wrestlers can bring the muscle, who are kind of people who know about criminal networks, who are highly mobile, who can wield violence, who the law actually, like the officials actually depend on, at the same time as, they're also criminals. So they're
criminal bounty hunters / police officers who can like cross jurisdictions.
Exactly. Yes, it's a very messed up system. And that actually comes up in my new book as well. When Tsuneno is living at the city magistrate's office, I talk a lot about how the city magistrate relies on criminals to enforce the law. Like a thief can catch a thief, right? It's kind of like a common idea of the early modern period.
Just crying out for the big budget HBO prestige TV series adaptation right there. So
yes, I would love that. If anybody from HBO is watching, like I'm here, send me an email. Tsuneno on HBO would be awesome. There is like a remake of Shōgun happening. And there was a very like popular Netflix series on the samurai. So I think there is like a lot of interest in this period.
Yeah. Kind of related to that, we've had a number of questions, like other than, of course, your books, which everybody's going to run out and buy immediately. Like if somebody wanted to kind of learn a little bit more about early modern Japan, like where would you, somebody who doesn't really know anything about the period, like kind of where would you point them?
That's a really good question. I would obviously, of course, like point them to my book if they want to know about Edo. There are good kind of textbook accounts. One of them is Andrew Gordon's book on modern Japan, which I have like behind me somewhere. A Modern History of Japan. Like if you want a textbook, this is a good one. There's also kind of Marius Janssen's Big History of Japan, which is beautifully written and like 1,000 pages long, which you can read. And then kind of like there's all sorts of good kind of scholarship on early modern Japan. But one of the best things to do if you're interested in just knowing what early modern Japan was like is to go on YouTube actually and look at kabuki, or look at No, or look at Bunraku, the puppet theater, because these cultural forms still survive. And although they do not survive in the same form, they can give you an idea of what Edo might have looked like and what Edo period people were really interested in. And so that's something I'm often like really excited to show my students. Another thing is, you know, all of the art of the Edo period is incredibly accessible. I often, for my book, would go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and just look at their database and just kind of take in all the art of this period to get a sense of like what people like to look at, what they like to wear, what the physical landscape might have looked like. So I think it's something that like we can get there by reading, but we can also get there kind of through all of this other media.
Interesting. You mentioned this a little bit early on when you were talking about this like right wing in Japan that's trying to push a certain narrative. So I was just wondering, is there like a certain, because in a lot of countries there's like a certain like national myth about the early modern period that they use in current politics. Is there like a certain like political story about the Edo period or early modern Japan that's like utilized in Japan today that sort of like frustrates your scholarship or helps your scholarship?
I'm not sure that it either frustrates or helps my scholarship, but there is definitely a kind of nostalgia for Edo, the city of Edo, and the Edo period as a kind of useful source of national pride and national identity. And there's a historian named Carol Gluck who's written a wonderful essay called The Invention of Edo, which gets at a lot of this. But the idea is that, you know, Japan's modern history is extremely fraught. Japan was an imperialist power. Tokyo was firebombed. There was the defeat in World War II, fascism, all of these kind of very traumatic experiences. And so when you're looking for a kind of usable history that one can be proud of, you know, the Edo period is 268 years of basically, not entirely, but compared to someplace like Europe or China, peace. And so there is a tendency to look back at Edo. You know, you can see Edo all over Tokyo. On the trains, there are posters about Edo. There are always things in the bookstore about Edo. There are museum exhibits about Edo. Of course, there's a museum dedicated to Edo. That is a way of kind of remembering Japanese culture. And a lot of it's invented, obviously, later, but before the influence of Westerners. And that's not exactly true because Japan was always a global place. But that makes Edo kind of a useful source of culture and of national pride. That doesn't really bother me. It bothers some historians. It doesn't bother me because I think I find the interest in Edo itself to be, in fact, really inspiring in the sense that people in Tokyo are always thinking about their history and thinking about the version of the city that came before. And obviously it's not universal, but Edo is very present in Tokyo in a way that I think if you walk around Chicago, you're not like thinking constantly about the 19th century, or at least I'm not. And so I
am, but yeah.
You are. Some people are. But I like that part of kind of Japanese popular culture that's always kind of looking backward and thinking about history. It does get distorted in ways that are problematic, but I think the kind of general idea that history is important and that we should be thinking about it a lot is something that I embrace.
Well, I think that's kind of a wonderful place to wrap up because we are unfortunately out of time. So thank you so much, Amy, for joining us today. This has been a really wonderful conversation. You can we put some links to different books that you recommended in the chat there, but of course you can go onto our bookshop page and you can see her books and purchase them, run out and get them for yourself as soon as possible. So thank you again, everybody, for taking your Friday evening and joining us. We'll be back next week with yet another exciting episode. But until then, let me simply say to everybody, thank you again and cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.